Okay, so Shachar just had a new baby and decided it was more important than Fox, so, what can we say? Okay, so this talk is part of the trying to figure out how can we prove a lower bound for computational efficiency of mechanisms that do good things. So this is what we're trying to do. And the setting is we're going to, when we talk about computational lower bound, we're going to talk about communication complexity. So we will want to show that mechanisms that do something good will have to have a high computational burden in terms of high communication complexity. So the notion that we use is Yao's communication complexity. We have two parties or more parties, and we just are counting how many bits of communications they need to exchange with each other before you get the result. And the communication complexity of a protocol is the worst communication complexity over all inputs, and the communication complexity of a problem is the communication complexity of the best protocol for it. So this is exactly Yao's model of communication complexity. And we're going to ask about proving lower bounds for communication complexity of mechanisms. And the mechanism is basically, in addition to just having an outcome, you also have payments as output. So the idea that now we're just thinking about the participant as selfish participants, and we're going to model them in our head as being as acting to optimize their own utility. And again, a mechanism is an incentive-compatible way to get the desired outcome that you want. So there's going to still be interaction between the two players, and at the end, we have an outcome which is both a certain alternative, one of many possible outputs that can be, and the payments for the different players. And the basic idea that we're going to always think about mechanisms that are incentive compatible in the sense that there's going to be a dominant strategy for each one of the players, which means that I know I should always act according to the protocol. I can never gain by deviating to any other thing. So whenever I say a mechanism, it's an incentive compatible mechanism. And what we want to do is show that if you have an incentive compatible mechanism that does something good, then it's going to have a high burden, computational burden, in the sense of having a high communication complexity. Okay, so that's the basic what we want to do. Okay, so because it's difficult to understand incentive-compatible mechanisms, actually we have a very easy characterization of it. And the characterization is what's called the taxation principle, which basically says that if you have any incentive-compatible mechanism, it's equivalent to the following form. And the following form is basically each player is basically presented a menu of alternatives, where each alternative that you can have this as the output, alternative output, if you pay this. You can have that as the output if you pay that. And each one of the players is represented with such a menu, and that menu is only a function of what the other players do. So basically, each player needs to choose the best option from the menu that he is presented, and somehow, miraculously, all the players choose the same outcome. And that's the whole point. And this is really an easy exercise to see that every incentive-compatible protocol is equivalent to one of these. And so we're continuing to think about protocols in this sense, about all the players except for me determine somehow the menu that I face, and then I choose the best one from the menu that I face, and the same happens to everyone. And so now you can try to find many complexity notions internal in this kind of model, and Shachar has identified the taxation complexity, which is basically how many different types of menus am I presented. So looking at all the possible values of the other players, for each possible tuple of values for the other players, I'm presented some kind of menu. And the question is, how many different menus do we have among all others? And notice that we're not concerned here with how complicated each one of the menus is, how big it is, or other questions, but only how many different menus does the mechanism are implied by the mechanism when I go over all possibilities of other players. Okay? And that will be called the taxation complexity of the mechanism, of the auction or of the mechanism. And the main theorem in this talk would be that the taxation complexity basically determines the communication complexity. So let me first say why this is trivial, and then why this is not trivial, and then also why this is wrong. But let's start why this is trivial. Okay, so it's trivial because if I, as a player, am presented many different, many different types of menus to choose from, then of course you would think that that information, if what is the menu that I'm faced with, that has to be sent to me. Okay? So that is indeed a correct argument if we're talking about one-way communication, that the other players are saying something and then I have to respond. But if it's a two-sided thing, then it's not clear because maybe I can say something and according to that they can say something else and so on. So it may be faster if we have an interactive protocol. So that's why it's non-trivial. What's really more interesting is the fact that it's even not true. It's still going to be the main theorem of this talk, but we first have to see why this is not true at all. So we're going to show that there exists an incentive-compatible mechanism, and it's going to be a natural one, where really there is a huge gap. The communication complexity is logarithmic in that taxation complexity. Even though there are many, many different menus presented to me, the communication complexity is much smaller. And this is going to be a significant example. And the significant example is I have to show you what is my mechanism. So my mechanism is going to be the following thing: the VCG mechanism applied to growth substitute valuations. Okay, so VCG mechanism means that the two players or many players, it doesn't matter. For this, we can talk about two players, each one having a growth substitute valuation. The outcome is the optimal allocation between them. And the payment is what VCG says it has to be, which is basically each one of them pays how much he hurts the other. Okay? So let's look at this kind of auction and think about what is its taxation complexity and what is its communication complexity. And maybe before that, we should talk. We should say what are growth substitute valuations. So we are in the setting of combinatorial auctions where we're selling M items to two players, let's say here. And each one of them has a valuation function that gives a value for each bundle of items. And we want to partition the items between them, between the two players or more players. And there are, of course, many types of possible valuations. And what's the only thing that's important for us for the definition of growth substitute valuations, besides the fact that it's sort of an interesting class, is that we know how to do allocation among these kind of sets efficiently. Okay, so for example, there exist equilibria there and so on. So now, once just armed with this knowledge, the first thing that it should be obvious, because we know how to find, as I already told you, that we have algorithms, good algorithms, to allocate between two players with growth substitute valuations, that good algorithm really has polynomial communication complexity, small communication complexity, and there are several types of different algorithms for that. The more interesting thing is that we have many different menus presented to each one of the players. So in fact, if we look, what are the menus that are presented to me? Basically, I would need to pay my externality on the other guy, which means the difference between what he would pay for his value for everything and his value for what he gets. So basically, that means that for any possible valuation of the other guy, I have to be presented with a different menu. And now the question is, how many possible valuations do you have in that class growth substitute? So that thing was sort of open for a while until 20 years earlier, Knus actually managed to count it and showed that there are doubly exponentially many, which means that really the taxation complexity is exponential. Okay, because there are doubly exponentially many different possible valuations in the growth substitute class. So this is an example that even though you have many different possible menus, yet you do get all these gains in communication. You do get an exponentially faster communication protocol. Okay, so that's said. And yet, the main theorem is that if you have something that's incentive compatible, not just from the growth substitute valuations, but for all valuations, then the lower bound holds. Okay? So if you take the algorithm that I just said for growth substitute and extend it any way that you wish to all valuations, maybe not in optimal way or any way that you extend it, it will already have high taxation, a high communication complexity. So the theorem says that this is the lower bound that you have, and there are similar theorems for other classes. Even if you have something that works for all submodular valuations, you have such a lower bound with some polynomial factor loss. Okay? So hopefully I will get to prove that at a certain point later in the talk. But now I want to show that it's optimal. And the way that Shachar organizes his talks is first I'll show why it's optimal, then I say why it's not true, and then I'll say, okay, so how do we fix that? Okay, so before we do that, I just want to say that the kind of application that you have, of course, this should be a tool for proving lower bounds on incentive-compatible mechanisms, a tool to basically one step and the way and the holy grail of what we would like to do is understand the trade-off between computational efficiency and incentive compatibility that we don't have. So this kind of general tool for lower bound may help us if we could prove that any good mechanism in a certain sense has a high taxation complexity, we got the kind of result that we want. Of course, we don't know how to prove that yet, but at least it's a good step. Okay, so let's look at the specific case of two players and try to see why this lower bound is tight. Okay, so what are we trying to show? Trying to show the basic idea that not only is the taxation a lower bound for the communication complexity, but that I can actually find a protocol that does that. Okay, so the basic idea is as follows: there are only two players. Now we're taking a special case. There are two players. I know what the menu that I induce on you is, so let me just send you that information, and you choose the best one from there, and you do the similar thing to me. And that's a proof that indeed you can do it even with 2 rounds with the communication with complexity that it moves the taxation. Okay, so that would seem to be a very simple thing. Okay, so each player sends the index of the menu that it uses on the others, and then the other just chooses the best option between them. The only tiny little problem with this kind of thing is that what happens if there are more than one possibility? They sort of have to coordinate so we have the same output. And Shachar determines the complexity of figuring out, once you know what the optimal prices are, just figuring out the tie, breaking the tie, he calls that the tie complexity of the auction. It's, again, a parameter of the auction. And once you fix for that, you have the theorem for 2 players that the communication complexity is exactly characterized by the taxation complexity plus the tie-breaking complexity. Now, of course, this really used in a very strong sense the fact that we have only 2 players, because when we have more than 2 players, no single player knows what is the menu that he induces on the other, because you need some kind of communication between the players to induce that. The theorem for more than 2 players is almost the same, but you need yet another problem, and that is how do the players that need to determine the price for some entry in the menu that they present to yet another player, how much communication do they need to do that? So again, this complexity doesn't talk at all about choosing among all the different possibilities, but just looking at a single possibility and figuring out, okay, how much do we want them to pay? And again, this is trivially a lower bound, and it turns out that it's an upper bound. And the theorem is it's not completely tight here, but that these 3 measures, taxation complexity, price determining complexity, and tie-breaking complexity, exactly characterize up to some polynomial loss the communication complexity of any auction mechanism, any mechanism. And by the way, with completely different techniques and some different measures, he has a similar theorem, a very similar theorem. But if you just look at how many value queries, now we're changing the model for just this little slide, changing the model instead of counting communication complexity, counting queries to the different valuations. And the question is, how many queries do you need? And it turns out that the analogous kind of things, so the taxation complexity does not change, but the tie-breaking complexity and the pricing complexity, they now change with the model, of course. So again, these 3 terms determine the complexity in terms of valuation queries, but let's go back now to communication complexity. Okay, so let me give the proof of the main lower bound. And the proof of the main lower bound goes like this. So we're going to have 2 players. One of them, the guy on the left, I always forget if his name is Laurel or Hardy, but the guy on the left, basically, we know that the left guy induces lots of different menus on the right guy. So for each possible menu that is induced on the right-hand guy, we can look one possible value of the left-hand guy. So we're putting on the left side lots of different possible valuations of the left guy, each one of them inducing a different menu for the right guy. And now comes the basic conceptual thing is, we're going to find a pair for each one of these, a valuation for the right-hand guy that is going to be a nice pair for the valuation that induces the menu. And that valuation is going to be the following very weird thing. The price you pay for a set is your value, which basically is your value. So I need to find the valuation for this guy. And the valuation that I find for a guy that's going to be the pair of this guy is basically, my value is exactly what I need to pay, which basically means that anything that I'm given will have net utility of 0 for me. Okay, so this is the valuation. Now there are a few just technical problems that Shachar is sort of putting under the rug, because maybe the menu is not monotone, maybe the menu, some items you never get, and so on, but that can be fixed. These are just technical problems. Okay? So now I have these many different pairs of value for the left guy that induces the menu, and value for the right guy that gets exactly value 0 for whatever he gets in that menu. And the number of pairs that we have is exactly the taxation complexity, because we have all the possible different menus. And now comes the interesting thing is that, should be on this slide? Yeah, okay. So for every pair, let's say for the blue pair, if you let them run, there is going to be some string of bits that's there's a protocol between them. Similarly, for the green guy, there's going to be another different protocol. And for the red guy, there's going to be a protocol. And the main claim is that these guys are what's called the fooling set. You cannot have the same protocol on the blue guys and on the green guys, for example. Okay, so that's the main observation here. And why is that it's impossible that you have okay. So once you have that, actually why this is the case, we'll have in the next slide. But the point is, once we know that you can't have the same protocol in each one of these pairs, then of course the number of bits that you need is at least log the different number of pairs, and you get the lower bound that you want. This is a classical fooling set argument. Okay? So we just need to see why is this the case that you cannot have the same protocol on these two pairs. So the basic idea of the fooling set argument is that if you do have the same idea, the same thing, then also if you mix and match them, the same protocol would exactly happen, because the blue guy would think he's in the first situation, the red guy would think he's in the second situation, and they will always have exactly the same output. But this is not something that's good here, and this is because this cannot happen here, because remember that when the blue guy plays against the other blue guy, his utility is 0, whatever the output is. When the red guy plays against the red guy, his utility is 0, whatever the output is. But since these are two different valuations, in one of the two cases, he will get positive utility in one of the two cases. Okay? And it's impossible, because at the end, this is something that I didn't say, that if you have a protocol that figures out the right allocation, the same protocol basically maybe with another bit can tell you whether you have positive utility or not. And that would be impossible, because the output that you would have to have, the answer that you would give in the mixed pair has to be the same as the output that you give in each one of the pure color pairs, and that would give you a contradiction, because in one of these cases you get positive utility. Okay, so that's basically the basic idea of a lower bound, technical things about how you get the valuation, and then there are all these corrections that I alluded to about the tie-breaking complexity and so on, but the basic lower bound is as we have. Okay, so going back to the original wrong statement, unless you're in a very small domain like row substitute, but if you have a large, significant enough domain that you can do this trick and take the menu and turn it into a valuation function, then really and putting aside these tiny little tie-breaking details, the taxation complexity is really the same as the communication complexity. The lower bound is strong, and it's almost tied up to these small things.